So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Marion. I'm the co-founder of the Positive Group. It's great to have you on today for this afternoon's webinar. Today we're going to be looking at the subject of focus, and in particular how we focus in a virtual working world, which I think we'll all agree is a pretty relevant subject at the moment. From Positive's perspective, this is, focus and attention is a huge area of our research and development. It's one of the 4 pillars of our curriculum and program. And so I think we're really excited to be covering this today because so many of the key risk and protective factors around our psychological health sit within this space. And I think looking at that, particularly in the current environment, is a really fascinating topic. It's also something that we have been talking to so many of our clients about, around how you actually do that for yourself, but also how we can improve the focus and the balance in terms of this new working way with teams across businesses. I think from our perspective, there's also the last few years has been really interesting around the topic of focus, and particularly around the concept of informational overload. There's been a lot of debate and research around the amount of information that we're all having to consume or is available to us, and what is the impact of that and the technology that it's driven through on our attention, how distractible we are, our relationships, our development. It's obviously a huge area of interest for education, and most importantly, what's the impact of that on our psychological health. So I think for us, this is such a big area and exciting area. I suppose if we place the pandemic on top of this and working virtually, this adds another layer of intrigue, and it's also, we're so early on in terms of what, this massive social experiment of us all working virtually. But there's probably 2 themes we want to pick up on here. One is that we're starting to see there's some data coming through around the trends of how we work virtually. And this isn't the same for everyone, obviously. We know that the pandemic drives very different experiences for all sorts of different people. But I think what we are starting to see is some data that's showing that our working days are longer. There was an HBR study across 3 million workers that showed the working day was increasing by about 8%, so just short of an hour. We're being invited to many more meetings. We're being copied into more emails. We're having to consume much more media and social media. So I think this information overload was already on an upward trajectory, and now I think it's getting greater and greater, particularly in the way that we're working. And I think the other theme to put on top of this is linked to what we talked about in the last webinar, particularly around anxiety. Is that there is an increased prevalence in psychological ill health and psychological problems, particularly anxiety, common psychological problems, levels of depression. We know that they are going to be going up considerably over the coming months and even years. So, and particularly within certain groups. So I think if we combine this way that we're working and what this newfound virtual environment is doing to our behaviors, but also the psychological health challenges of that, it could be a really perfect storm. And what we want to look at today is actually thinking about this in a different way. Think about this as an opportunity. I think virtual working has got many opportunities if it's done in a brain-friendly way. So with my colleagues today, I think there's sort of 3 things we want to try and pick off. One is, how has the pandemic impacted on our attention and our focus? Secondly, what's this relationship between psych health and attention? It's bi-directional, incredible relationship between those 2 pieces, which is fascinating. And then thirdly, just looking at what are some of the opportunities that face us particularly as leaders and as individuals, that can actually start to shift the dial on our levels of attention, and then obviously our psychological health, performance, etc. So that's the aim of today. let's get on with it. We've got I've got two colleagues with me. You'll be glad to hear are experts. Dr. Alice G, who is a clinical psychologist, has been working with Positive for I think 5 years now, leading a lot of our projects globally, particularly working with leaders. She's also got a big interest in attention and focus and attentional training. She's worked with a lot of talented sports stars and talented athletes around applying some of these techniques. So welcome, Alice. We also have Dr. Brian Marion, the other co-founder of Positive. He is a medic, health psychologist, cognitive and behavioral therapist, and has a background in psychological medicine. So I think we're in good shape. Brian, I'm going to come to you first, presuming you're paying attention. I think you're muted, actually, which you may not be. Anyway, first question to you. We talk a lot about attention and focus. Be good to just get a bit of reference around that from a psychological perspective and how our brain works around attention.
Yeah, sure. Might be worth going to the first slide if you're happy to put that up. I think this is a fascinating area. I think as Will's suggested, COVID has been the perfect storm in lots and lots of ways. It's activated our threat circuit. And one of the reasons for that is it presses lots of primordial buttons. And we become anxious when we don't know what's happening. And we have we don't like uncertainty and threat. And what I think is fascinating about attention, so our ability to focus, is actually quite limited. When you scan your spotlight around the world, you focus on certain things, but therefore you neglect other things. And this concept of focus and neglect, I think, is key here. What's been shown is that our attentional capacity is very, very limited as human beings. So it's estimated that your brainstem receives about 14 million bits of data per second from your body. Now, you ignore 99.999% of that. We only rarely focus on things that are salient, that are actually present and threatening or concerning, or we want to focus our attention on some work. But I just want to emphasize the limitation of this attentional span. Your attention basically can deal with about 4 bits of data for 90 seconds. That's your working memory. And that is a tiny percentage of all the data that's coming in. So we're immediately narrowing down and creating a bottleneck of data that's allowed into the system. And that bottleneck decides what we pay attention to. What's fascinating, and we'll come onto this in more detail, when we're feeling anxious or threatened, we focus on the threat. And if you didn't focus on the threat, you'd get taken out of the gene pool pretty quickly. This is a survival mechanism. So the threat response is the most powerful neural circuit in your brain and body. It hijacks everything, and it demands that you pay attention. And it also shifts how you think, feel, and behave. So when you're anxious, you can see yourself as vulnerable. You can see the world as dangerous. You see the future as spooky and uncertain. So just to bring this alive, if you think about, I travel up to London, or did, to the office in Fleet Street for many years. And I'd get on the train each morning. And at this time of year, if I heard someone cough, my cognition might be, if I noticed it, might be asthma, hay fever, interesting. But actually, it then drifts off into the ether. I get no emotional shift. I get no physiological shift. And my behavior is to go back to listening to my podcast or reading my book. However, post-COVID, and this is the really important process, is post-COVID, a cough or a sneeze now has a completely different salience. It has a different meaning. And that cognition, the thoughts and the images that I have about the cough, could be, oh my God, this could be a COVID spreader, a super spreader. The carriage is now full of virus particles. And I start to feel worried. But then my worry creates some different thinking. It shifts my thinking, and I start to have spooky thoughts. I see myself as vulnerable. I might be infected. I might be one of those unfortunate people who get very ill. And then I start to imagine myself ending up in hospital. I see myself going onto a ventilator. These images and thoughts then amplify my emotion, but my emotion then hijacks my thinking, and creates my focus onto the threat. And the reason this is so important is that this is our homeland security. It's our hypervigilant mode. We focus on threat above anything else. But just to finish on this, I think there's an interesting concept that makes human beings very different. Is the threat real or is it imagined? Now, there was a great book by Sapolsky some years ago called Why Don't Zebras Get Ulcers? Zebras don't get ulcers because they outrun the lioness and then they are safe and they go back to eating the grass. Human beings outrun the lioness if they escape, or don't outrun it, but escape from it. And then they start to think, where's the lioness? Is it behind the rocks over there? Is it in the long grass? Is it going to take my children while I'm away from home? The point here is those imaginary threats can also activate the same neural circuit. They have what neurologists or neuroscientists call functional equivalence. So what we're thinking and what's going through our head can activate our threat state and keep us in a threat state, which then keeps us focused on the threat. And the emphasis here is that it hijacks your bandwidth. You have no bandwidth left for anything else. Back to you, Will.
No, I that's really interesting. I think it's what's the crux of this is how can we control what comes into our conscious awareness, and I think that I look forward to digging into that later. But just quickly from you, I mean that how do we actually start to control what comes into our conscious awareness?
Well, I think the first thing is to become aware that you're doing it. So self-awareness and awareness of what you're using your mind for. I think a lot of us are not actually in an executive role here for a lot of the time. We're being driven by events, external interruptions, internal interruptions, thoughts and images. So I think the first step is awareness. And the second step is to recognize that you have a primary appraisal. And then what you can do is start to bring in a secondary appraisal, which is more rational, logical, and objective. And that is a fantastic technique for regulating those intrusive thoughts.
And we could spend all day just talking about that, I know. But so I suppose to look at this and try and compartmentalize this, we look at this in terms of interruption. What comes into our awareness. We look at this in sort of broadly speaking 2 buckets. One is external interruption, so stimuli coming in from outside. So, phones, the door going, colleague coming to your desk, or less so these days, or something happening that takes your attention away. And then internal interruptions, and particularly around sort of thoughts and images. We'll get onto the latter shortly. But Alice, just coming to you. Be great to get your sense of external interruptions is so key at the moment, particularly with information overload and also the technology that we're working with. How could you just share a bit more about that and how that's been impacted by virtual working in the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and if we think about pre-pandemic, back in the old days, when we used to go into the office, and the kinds of interruptions that would be there would be people generally. If you're in an open plan office, for example, there's lots of distraction, and as you said, people coming to your desk. And then there's the classic emails that keep coming into, with those notifications on your screen. And each time that happens, you switch your attention momentarily to that because it's novel and it moves and it takes your attention. And then you try and get back onto task. And phones ringing, phones pinging, all the usual things that were there before, as we have, as you said, that information overload, so much to pay attention to. And then since the pandemic, some of that is still there. So the phones and the emails, but then we have additional distractions such as, from working from home. If you happen to have children, they will be providing a huge distraction, or pets, or whatever it may be. Or as you said, delivery to the door. There are new distractions, but also we've really become very reliant on technology, because we have to in order to work remotely for those of us who do so. And that has really made us consume technology so much more. And so we tend to be flitting quite a lot between different things on our desktop, for example. And I think that's probably increased for a lot of people. So the environment in which we work, for some people, is fantastic. If they've got a nice large house with a dedicated study, they can really focus well. And others, however, will be in shared spaces, shared accommodation with, whatever other distractions, and they've got a corner of their kitchen or their bedroom or whatever in order to work in, and it's not ideal, and that will be providing other kinds of external interruptions to the way that they can focus. I mean, it's very different for different people in these times, I think.
Absolutely, and I mean, a lot of work's done around the attentional economy, and this cost of switching, which links into the fallacy of multitasking as well. What are your thoughts on the cost of switching?
Yeah, the cost is high. I mean, it really is. What we do, basically, your attention is linear in general. When a lot of people think they can multitask, but actually they're moving very quickly from one task to another. They're switching quickly. Mm-hmm. And each time you switch, that costs your brain energy. It also costs time to get back onto task. So say you have an email that pings in and it takes your attention, you've then got to bring your attention back, as I said, and that throughout the day takes a lot of time and a lot of brain energy, and it starts to make you less efficient with your thinking, with your decision making. It starts to affect how you learn and how you retain information, actually. So that there is a huge cost. And I think one of the big issues here is thinking about what we call our ultradian rhythms. Ordinarily, back in the old days when we had physical meetings with people, you would go from one meeting to the next, and you might walk along the corridor from one place to the next. You might actually have a quick chat on the way because you see someone, at their desk or whatever. And so you're breaking up the day a bit more. And what's happening now is we have these Zoom marathons. People are at their desk and they're having more meetings, right? Probably slightly shorter than face-to-face meetings, but more of them. And then you're just sitting at your desk, one after the other, and there are no breaks. And that then is costly because your brain needs to be able to recharge in between times. And actually, if that's not happening, you find your productivity going down. And we've got to be really conscious of this and trying to kind of be aware and then start to take steps to manage that better.
No, absolutely. And there's some, there seems to be some suggestion that Zoom meetings or whatever platform you're using, virtual meetings are more draining. And I think we talk a lot about managing, energy and attention, not time. And I think that's something that's really come into scrutiny in a virtual space.
Yeah, and I see that personally in my clinical practice. I've gone entirely to Zoom until last week when I went back into the office. So I see person after person on a screen, and it takes a lot of energy to read people well. It takes a lot of energy to when you there's all sorts of things. You can only see their head and shoulders. You can't pick up all the signals we normally do in a social interaction. And I went back in the office for the first time last week, and it was so refreshing and so easy to interact and to read people. So there is a cost in that way too. The amount of attention to just read people well in those interactions. I think it's difficult. It is, and it can be exhausting.
And the cognitive energy that takes up in terms of constantly being alert. And I think if you're in a big meeting, the attention's not on you for quite a long time. So you can actually, you're not on show all the time. Whereas if you're in a small square, it's very different. Brian, any thoughts on that?
No, I think just picking up on Alice's point about switching and energy, I think what's interesting is that your brain is about 3 or 4% of your body weight, and it uses up 20% of your energy. And if you're worrying or ruminating or switching, it uses up much more energy. And I think this is a really important process, that we need to be careful what we're using our brain for, our mind for. But I think, as Alice suggested, we need to give our brain a break. What's been shown is that if you give your brain a break and you boot it at intervals, you will get much better performance from it. So this is a cognitive function indicator. And if you beat your brain for long periods of time, it starts to deplete its cognitive resources. And I think cognitive fitness for most of us is a really important parameter in our day-to-day work, and maintaining that cognitive fitness, I think, is key.
Absolutely, and links into those boundaries that we talked about, and how we build that in from an individual perspective, but also how organizations create a culture around this is fascinating. It'd just be good to move on to internal interruptions, and in particular look at this incredibly clear link between focus and psychological health, which we've known about for some time, but I just want to share. So just to tee this up, I just want to share some data that we've collected in the last few weeks, just to show this, and then we'll get into that. I'm going to test my multitasking here. Hold on. Right. So this is some data we collected. So it's a global data set that is predominantly expert professionals, people in professional services organizations across Europe, US, Asia mainly. What we've done is we just pulled out some data from this report, which we'll be releasing in the next week or so, just to sort of set the scene around how psychological health and well-being links into distractibility, and our attentional capabilities. So what we've seen is that there's a sizable number of individuals that are reporting feeling distracted, unable to concentrate, unable to switch off from their work. And this is around most days or every day over the past few weeks. So you would expect that, and we are seeing an increase in that. And obviously there's a big difference between unable to switch off and then unable to concentrate, but they're also very much linked. So this is a sort of a general trend that we're seeing. This is, probably in many ways unsurprising, but it's just this incredibly significant relationship between those who report being highly distracted, report significantly lower psychological well-being compared to those who are less distracted. And I think this is just really, if you look at the difference between this, well-being really is a portal to focus, productivity, attention. And there's so many benefits that come off that in terms of, particularly around relationships, around how we interact, how we support each other, which is so important. We've also just looked at this in terms of some of the key psychological challenges. So we talked a lot in the last webinar about anxiety and the prevalence of anxiety going up enormously. So this is something we are going to be seeing a huge increase on, and particularly, as I say, among those younger demographics. And what we're seeing is that those that report feeling anxious are 3 times more likely to report being distracted. If you take that into depression, we're looking at more than 3 times more likely, and over 50% reporting being distracted most days or every day at work. So just the cost of this, I mean, this is presenteeism, isn't it? But the cost of this is so significant. I think this is just really interesting from a leader's perspective, because we'll come on to leaders in a bit, but they're just so important around setting the culture, setting the scene around this, and also the impact that they have on other people that we know is far, far greater. So the sort of emotional contagion of leadership is enormous. So if you have leaders who are distracted and feeling burnt out or stressed, it's going to have a huge impact on the culture of a team or a business. So leaders who report lower well-being are 6 times more likely to report being unable to switch off, and 4 or 5 times more likely to report issues with concentration and distractibility. And then I think this is just finally, we talk a lot about this. We know from all studies really that social support is the biggest protective factor around psychological health, and it's particularly clear now in this pandemic. So those who work in supportive environments where they feel good levels of support from colleagues, line managers, senior leadership, report significantly less issues with distractibility. And I think that's such a good message for organizations and leaders. So I suppose what this does is it really shows that there are a number of portals with which we can influence focus, and psychological health is so entwined with focus. Alice, just starting with you, what are your thoughts on this link between psychological health, that data we've just shared, and focus?
Well, it's pretty stark, isn't it? And maybe a little bit shocking, that there's such a strong sort of correlation there. And it is about, even in the most perfect working environment, if what's going on internally is interruptive, because actually what you've got is a high degree of emotional arousal. You've got anxiety, you've got low mood and depression. These things are going to hijack your mind. And so as Brian was saying, you know, that's how your brain is designed, you know, to make you think, because actually it's about your survival. It's your survival mechanism that's at play. So it comes back again to awareness, because if you're not conscious of how much you might be worrying or ruminating, or how much you might be berating yourself for the fact that you're worrying, we call that meta emotion, having feelings about our own feelings, that can leave us trapped in that cycle and staying in that threat state, you know, just because of what we're thinking about. So we have to start to become aware of how we're thinking and how we're feeling, so that we can take a step back and accept, actually, you know, these are really difficult times. We're going to have thoughts and feelings that might be hard to manage sometimes, but taking a step back allows us then to choose perhaps where we put our focus to. And it all begins with that awareness, because otherwise we get locked into ruminative cycles, unhelpful self-talk, berating ourselves for being distracted, for example, which isn't going to help either. So, you know, there's a lot that in the mix there, and it all comes back to starting to pay attention to our attention. What are we thinking about, and how helpful is that? And is there a more helpful way that we could be responding to things? But it's about taking care of ourselves as well, you know, starting to think about what's going on in our lives generally and in the work context, and where can we make small changes in order to manage our emotional regulation. Because if we can manage our emotions better, that leads to greater psychological well-being, which then allows us to attend to our attention better and regulate that attention. So you get into this nice virtuous cycle with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this you know, the internal interruptions is so interesting, because it holds the key to so many psychological health challenges. You mentioned rumination there, and the half-life of these interruptions, you know, can take on a world of its own. It can actually take over your life. And I think one of the challenges about virtual working is you don't get to pick up the cues of how people are feeling, you know, unless you're on a virtual call, but even then it's not the same. So, you know, you don't get the opportunity as a colleague, a peer, a leader to actually, you know, put your arm around, metaphorically, that person at the right time to you know, to see where they're feeling. Because I think it can really get a life of its own, can't it, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think just picking up on that and what Alice was saying, I think what interests me is that we've seen with the Office for National Statistics and UCL's data that you know, pre-COVID, you had 1 in 6 of the working population fulfill the diagnostic criteria for anxiety. You now have 1 in 3. So 1 in 3 workers are now experiencing anxiety. And I think, as Alice said, one of the problems is that worry then hijacks your bandwidth, because worry is threat. Threat then hijacks your bandwidth. So you don't have any bandwidth left for other things. You then get caught in this circuit. And I think this is particularly relevant to some of the work we do with expert professionals, is when you lose bandwidth, your concentration, your memory, your decision-making start to become impaired, which is a key quality indicator and a key performance indicator. Then what can happen to expert professionals, particularly professionals who care about the quality of their work, is they find they can't concentrate, they can't make the decisions, they're not at top form. They can then start, as Alice suggested, getting this worry about not performing optimally. And not performing optimally then makes them feel more distressed. And we've seen lots of people who actually get distressed about feeling distressed, because it impacts on their cognitive function, their physical health, or their quality of life. So this is a very sticky and perverse area, because what it does is it takes you into this cognitive emotional fusion, rumination, and then you can get stuck in it. And what we need to be teaching people is techniques. We all need to understand techniques that can act as circuit breakers that actually help us to recover our equilibrium and come out of that cognitive emotional fusion.
Absolutely. And just just picking up on that, the data point around social support and supportive environments, you know, why is that having an impact on distractibility?
Are you asking Alice or me? Alice, you go.
Well, I think social support is just absolutely vital. I think it's the one key point, really. If anyone can make any change, it's to start to support each other. Because if we feel supported, if we feel that people have our backs, that they're interested in who we are, that they are there for us, be that colleagues or leaders or whoever it may be, what that does is it helps us step away from that threat state. It helps us to reach a point of neurological safety. And it just settles everything down, and that means then that we can start to, choose where to put our focus again, because we're not having those internal distractions that are hijacking our mind. So and it might be quite a surprising point to make, really, that actually in order to focus better we need social support, but it's completely fundamental. And I think if it's the one key message people take home today, I think that's what it is. It's to be able to be really present for each other, especially now that everything is virtual. So we don't have that ordinary kind of moving around each other physically as we do in an office space. That I think people have to think much harder about how you recreate a sense of belonging, a sense of collaboration, a sense of camaraderie, and all those kind of points, really, that allow people to feel neurologically safe and therefore able to be less distracted. I think it's absolutely vital.
I'd agree with that. I think what Alice and I and others at Positive do a lot is talk about and are amazed by the impact of social support. But if you look at animal studies and particularly human studies, the impact of social support, friends, family, colleagues. If you look at the armed forces, cohesive, collaborative, collegiate groups have a far lower incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder. It mitigates threat. And one of the things we found in one of our studies was that good social support and good leadership ameliorates threat. And there's something about being part of a team, people having your back, thinking about each other. And I think this links to the stories we tell each other, but also being present for each other. I think as belonging is key.
And I think that's really important, that being present with each other. And also from a social support angle, we know that from a lot of data, and our data is that it's even more powerful when it's coming from a leader, because of the level of uncertainty or perceived certainty or uncertainty that leader controls around, particularly around economic future, prosperity, your own personal journey. So I think that's so that's a really important factor to think about in terms of that. I'm just keen, with your aware of time, moving on to some of the solutions. Any final thoughts on that link between psychological health and focus from either of you?
I just flag up rudeness. I think one of the fascinating things is that two things. One is that when you get stressed yourself, and there's lots of research on this, when we get stressed, our ability to pick up on other people's cues and signals drops because our bandwidth is hijacked. If you look at teachers, doctors, nurses, the caring professions, what happens is that the milk of human kindness curdles a bit because we haven't got the bandwidth for talking to other people, listening to other people. I think this is a key message. The other thing is that when we get stressed, we're more likely to be irritable, or we're more likely to push how we feel inside into the world. And if we're rude to people, what's fascinating is the research shows that about 60% of their cognitive function goes offline for about an hour. Why? Because they're focusing on the threat, and they can't focus on their work. Witnessing someone being rude to somebody hijacks about 40% because you think, oh my God, am I going to get this next? This is a threatening environment. So I think, this whole concept that we cannot not communicate, and I think that message that Alice put at the beginning, this self-awareness of how we're messaging, but rudeness is the opposite end of the spectrum to being supportive, collaborative, and cohesive. Yeah.
That might be the perfect example of an external interruption that then turns into an internal interruption, and the cost of that the focus lost around aggressive or confrontation or rudeness is going to be huge. I think it's probably even going to be even greater in a virtual sense, because there's no one then to actually run that past or discuss it with in a way that you probably would in an office. Fascinating. Okay, so I just keen to move on to just with 10 minutes to go, keen to move on to looking at sort of solutions, because I think what we're facing here is a bit of a junction where the choices we make and the decisions we make around how we work against those internal factors, those external factors, and how we set this up to be brain friendly could make an enormous difference to our psychological health, to our relationships. It's going to make a massive difference to our productivity, performance, and we haven't even got into areas like creativity, innovation, etc. But I think this is going to be the difference between how we sort of set up for success and being sustainable. And it's going to link through to a whole level of things around engagement, discretionary effort, how we feel and how we feel we belong to teams, etc. So I'd love to just spend 10 minutes thinking about some of the solutions that we can look at. I know we can't go into this in much depth. So Alice, maybe I'll come to you first and just think about just focusing on leaders and line managers in particular. What practical advice would we be giving to them at this point that can actually they can start to think about or challenge or change in what they're doing, but also what they're doing with their teams?
Yeah, and I think, again, we come back to the first point being awareness of their own sort of emotional state, whether they're highly anxious and if that's sort of spreading out within their teams, but also thinking about how individuals within their teams are actually being interested in that, understanding it, normalizing the fact that people have different levels of anxiety. People can tolerate uncertainty differently. Some people are very good at it. Others still need to kind of find mechanisms to help them to tolerate uncertainty better. So those are things that are really important. And then essentially we come back to this sense of social support. If you are paying attention to people, being fully present. So when you're on a call with people, you haven't got interruptions coming in, you are fully there so that people feel that they're actually important, that they're visible. That really matters, And actually what you're then doing is role modeling as a leader, as a manager. You're role modeling how to manage uncertainty, how to manage anxiety, how to be there for people. And you're setting you're shifting culture where that's needed. There's new social norms about what's okay, and I think that feels really key. And it all comes down to communicating. It's opening up the channels of communication, making sure there's frequent communication and that it's two-way, without making people feel they're being micromanaged. That's not what we want, but it is about, especially with this virtual working that we're all doing, it's making sure people are feeling that sense of belonging because the communication is there. I think some of the key points really.
Absolutely, I think that role modeling is key, isn't it? If we want organisations to behave differently and not just translate what we did in the office to the virtual world, which we know isn't going to work, we have to role model. We have to experiment. We have to be seen to be doing things differently and trying things out and seeing how that works, what the impact is. Thank you. And then just from an individual perspective, thinking about both external, internal interruptions, what would our advice be to individuals who can to make a difference around this in very busy lives?
Yeah, I think one of the key points, there's a couple of things to mention here. One of them is about boundary setting. I think a lot of people have found that in working remotely, they've lost the normal boundaries they would have had between home and work, right? You're inviting people into your homes because they're, the cameras are coming straight into your rooms. And I think that's an issue for a lot of people. So it's about how do you create boundaries? You're not leaving your house to go to work and on the commute, but that's a really useful boundary for a lot of people. So really thinking about how you bring boundaries in for yourself, so that actually, you're starting work at a certain point and finishing at a certain point. So the day doesn't expand as it has been doing. What we've seen is peak emails at sort of between 1 and 3 a.m. or something. There's really interesting data about how people are working and the shift in our working day. So bringing in boundaries so that actually we feel we can focus better and making that a bit more watertight. And then, sorry.
And I think one of the pushbacks on that is, some people think that that's not working, as hard. And I think, we were talking the other day about some of the research around emails and how actually, if you have more focused attention, if you can recharge properly, the quality of your work is going to be so much higher. So I think this is a fallacy that it's, the less time is the less output. And I think looking at this in terms of output, not time, is key.
Well, that's really interesting. There's a piece of research that came out, it was Kushlev and done a few years ago, and they showed that actually if you only check your emails 3 times in the day, rather than having them coming all the way through your day, it lowers stress, which therefore lowers threat, which means that you're going to be able to focus better. And I think there was a note there that said that you would claim back 20% of your time by doing so. I mean, it makes you so much more efficient. So there are certain techniques that we can use that really help us to do that. And one of the things I want to mention is we have a tool which we share, which is the positive switch. And I think that's that point about becoming aware of your own attention, paying attention to your attention. Do you need to be focusing on task? Do you need to be actually switching your attention to giving yourself a break, even if just for 5 minutes, to kind of recharge, you know, and then to be thinking about actually perhaps being more present and, you know, bringing your attention to the present moment, especially if you're on a call with someone, and being fully there because of the impact that has. So ways in which we just become aware of what our attention is doing and taking more control of that consciously, I think.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. I think that's some great advice in there. But Brian, anything you'd add to that?
I suppose I'd just go back to the beginning and say anxiety levels are high. Anxiety and worry actually is a neuroplastic process. So what I mean by that is that the more you do it, the better you get. You wire up neurons for it. And what we know is that people who worry for long periods of time start to get more deleterious impact from it. We should be looking at techniques that help people mitigate that worry and ruminative circuit. And what I think is really exciting is that there's a big area of research now around what's called attentional training. Attentional training is the ability to switch your focus of attention, to step away from that ruminative circuit. They're basically circuit breakers. And what's been shown is that this whole area of worry management, so creating worry times, looking at worries that are useful and useless, it's interesting that 96% of the things we worry about never happen. Now that uses up a shed load of energy. So how can we make our brains more efficient? How can we work with the grain of our brain? Understanding how our mind works, I think, informs some fantastic tools for helping that process. And I just finished by this concept of tolerance of uncertainty in leadership. What we know is that if leaders have a high tolerance of uncertainty, their organizations are more successful. They do better, partly because of the stories they're telling themselves, but the stories they're telling other people. And as leaders, you cannot not communicate. I think if you can give a sense of hope, agency, pathway, how we're going to make this happen, then you start to mitigate other people's stress. And how we communicate and that collegiality, that support is also key. So I think there's some really exciting ways to help manage this current difficult environment that we're finding ourselves in.
Absolutely. Thank you. I just had a distraction. The door's just been banged, but anyway, I'll ignore it. I think, yeah, that's really helpful, and hopefully those solutions can be picked up by, you know, some of those watching today. I suppose in summary, I think, you know, what we're hearing is there's a huge amount we can do about this. We need to look at both external, but particularly looking at internal interruptions and how we create the right environment to support both of those. And the pathway into that really is around psychological health and some of those key variables around psychological health, particularly around emotional awareness, and I think social support and human connection, which is under serious challenge at the moment in the way that we're working. I think there's also just there's a piece, you know, around individuals and leaders. We can't expect individuals to change behaviors without leaders role modeling. And what leaders do and how they communicate is also probably the most controllable factor that they can influence around general psychological health. So I think what's exciting is that the difference between good practice and poor practice around this is enormous in terms of our focus, psych health, relationships, you know, all of these factors. So it's exciting that there's a lot we can do about it. But I think organizations and individuals, and we're finding this a positive, we're going to have to experiment. You're going to have to see what works best and what works best for you. And also think, you know, times are going to change very quickly as we're all getting used to. Just finally, before we go, aware we're out of time. If anyone wants to, if anyone listening today wants to get in touch with Positive to understand more about what we do, what we talked about today, and particularly focus sits, as I mentioned, in everything that we look at. And these are the 4 key areas that we can support you around. So we have the Positive Leaders Program, which builds psychological skills and capability within line managers and senior leaders. We have Positive Now, which is an online learning solution which can provide large teams or organizations with the knowledge and the tools to apply and build a common language within your organization. We have Talks, which are looking at some of these really key psychoeducational factors which in and of themselves can challenge our cognition and behaviors. And we have Insights, and I've shared a couple of those insights with you today, but we have a people health check-in and a culture health check-in that gives us and you in particular the ability to understand what it is that's driving psychological health and performance within your organization. I just want to say thank you to Alice and Brian, and thank you to everyone who's attended. We'll let you know when the next webinar is coming and what it's about, but thank you all and see you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.